Good afternoon, everybody.
Yes.
Welcome today. It's really great to see everybody here today. And before we get started, I just wanted to tell you there's some candy up here, and we have some interesting costumes today as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. David Fusco. I'm currently the Interim Associate Dean for Undergraduate and Graduate Studies here in IST. Welcome to the 8th Annual George McMurtry Excellence in Teaching and Learning Award today. It's also a time for us to really reflect on the importance and how much we respect our teaching in our college here. The award is given out annually, and it is from a generous contribution from Dr. George McMurtry and his wife, Margaret. They are unable to be with us today, but we are recording this for them to take a look at later. So we really appreciate everything that they've done for us with this. This award is given out annually in IST, and it is in a recognition of looking at faculty who really take a deep look at creative and innovative ways in their teaching. And we look at student success, and this is an award that is nominated and awarded from a peer base, right? So the award winner is really given from the faculty here in IST. This year award winner is Jeff Rimland, who you'll hear from here in a few minutes. He is an assistant teaching professor here in IST. Jeff really looks at a lot of different ways for creating innovation in his classes. He uses a lot of new methods, new programming tools, and really is focusing on student engagement. And you kind of really see this when you talk to his students. They'll talk a lot about later on, you know, when they come back to Penn State and talk about their time after graduation, they'll talk about the kinds of interactions that Jeff really brought to the classroom that made it really special for them. This particular award has several components to it. There are two $500 gifts that are associated with this. One is a direct $500 to Jeff, as he would like to spend. And the other $500 goes into an account where he can use it within his teaching that he wants to use towards any kind of teaching initiatives or learning initiatives as he sees fit. In addition, his name will be placed on a plaque upstairs here in Westgate on the 3rd floor over by the elevators on that side. So I wanted to, again, congratulate Jeff on his award this year, and thank you for his persistence in teaching excellence.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So we also have this awesome lion for Jeff, and he said he has a great place that he can place it in his office.
That's right. I have a perfect spot on my desk for it. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. All right. Put this over here where it's safe. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming out. I appreciate it. I'd especially like to thank right off the bat the McMurtrys for supporting this award. They couldn't be here today, but I had a really nice email conversation with Dr. McMurtry, so I really appreciate him kind of reaching out in that way, and also for the way that he supports improving the quality of our teaching. So thanks to them, and thanks to all of you for coming. So before I start talking about some of the ways that I think are techniques that could lead to the best that we have to offer in teaching, I want to start out by talking a little bit about one of my worst experiences. So it was early in my undergrad days. It was in a math focus class. It was a long time ago, so I don't really remember if it was math or something like Physics 2 that relied heavily on math. Let's call it Physics 202, but I don't want to single out the physics department. So he sat down, and this instructor came in, and he started writing on the, it was probably chalkboard, maybe whiteboard at the time, and he said a few words, and his face was about 6 inches from the whiteboard, and he was talking, and he was writing, and he was writing, and he was writing, and about a minute in, a hand went up. I didn't know what he was talking about, and another hand or two went up, and he's just continuing, and he's going on and on and on, and our memories kind of distort these things a little bit. But in my memory, he went on for about 45 minutes and went around the entire whiteboard, did a lap around the room and started erasing. And I'm sure it wasn't actually that bad, but the way that my memory presents it is, he's going on and on and on and just basically kind of just dumping information. And this is unfortunate because he had an opportunity. I mean, he obviously knows a lot about physics or calculus or whatever it was that he was presenting. He obviously knows a lot about it. And he had a great opportunity to really communicate and help people learn about it. But unfortunately, all that he did was sort of reduce the experience to something that could have been replicated by a textbook. I mean, him standing up there and showing off how much he knows and losing track of the fact that people have questions or people want to talk about it. He, I guess, technically communicated some information, but he didn't really take advantage of that situation. So it occurred to me as I was thinking back about this that the primary responsibility of an instructor, the primary responsibility of a teacher is to listen and to think about ways that you can modify what your ideas are in order to actually be most useful to the people who are learning, instead of just thinking about a presentation and these are some facts that I'd like to come up here and say. I know lots of facts. I've been doing this for a long time. These are my facts. You'd love these facts that I have. Instead of going up there with that perspective, it's much more advantageous to actually be very tuned in to what your audience needs and what they're listening for. So some of you know I'm a private pilot. This is Aviation Metaphor #1 for those of you who are going to keep track. There's not that many. When I first started flying, an instructor gave me the best aviation advice that I've ever had, and that's no matter what happens, keep on flying the airplane. Now, flight instructors are a little bit more, they have a little bit more flexibility in their choice of words than college instructors do, so I'm not going to give you the full quote, but it was a little bit better than what I'm giving you now. When you're flying an airplane, there's a lot of things that you have to do. You have to make sure that you're tuned to the right radio frequency and that you're headed the right direction and you're on the right fuel tank, and that there's all kinds of regulations that you have to follow. But lots of those things can be sort of ignored momentarily. What you can't ignore at all is the fact that you're flying this airplane, and if you point it the wrong direction, you're going to crash it into the ground. So what flight instructors tell you over and over is that no matter what happens, keep on flying the airplane, or with some extra words in there sometimes. And I've actually had it happen where, one of my first flights, I was trying to make sure that I had the perfect radio call to the control tower, to air traffic control, and I'm thinking through everything I'm going to say, and I had this little knee board, and I'm writing down these notes for what I'm going to say to make sure that I have this great radio call. And then I key the mic to make the call, and I notice that we're kind of headed towards the ground. I'm with the instructor at this point, so, he's like, fly the plane, remember. So, when you're in aviation, the key thing, your key primary responsibility that you have to remember is to keep on flying the airplane. Keep it pointed, keep the blue side up, keep it pointed in the right direction. In teaching, I feel like the primary responsibility is listening. And it's not always literally listening with your ears. Sometimes it's looking at results of an examination or looking at feedback reports that you get or something like that. But you have to always be in touch with what students and what other faculty members and what industry is communicating to you, and you can't just think about it as I'm the source of information, because nowadays you can find all that online, and if we just think of ourselves as the source of information, then we're going to be quickly replaced by a YouTube video, because they can watch it in the car, or there's a lot more flexibility with YouTube. So we really have to think about what's our primary responsibility to add value? So my first time teaching, Fred's not here, I'm going to talk about him a little bit though. So my first time teaching was IST 240, and Fred Fonseca was kind enough to spend a few hours with me. He sat down and kind of gave me some advice and some tips. This is kind of the level that they're going to be at. These are some things that have worked. These are some things that haven't worked. And there are two pieces of advice that he gave me when we were talking that really kind of stuck with me to this day. The first piece of advice that he gave me was, don't go up there with a PowerPoint slide that has your code on it and talk to the PowerPoint slide. People will get bored after 5 minutes if you go up there with a PowerPoint slide full of code. The better way to keep the audience's attention is to go up there with your programming environment and sit down there and type in real time while you're talking. Now this sounded terrifying to me at the time. So I kind of smiled and nodded to Fred and made a mental note. All right, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go in with my PowerPoint slide, because I was coming from a research background, This is an actual PowerPoint slide from my dissertation. So at the time, we tend to do this kind of death by PowerPoint, and that was the mode that I was in. So the other bit of information, or bit of wisdom that Fred, and I'm going to come back to the suggestion from Fred a few times over the course of this conversation. Another suggestion that he gave me that I immediately fell in love with the idea of was the weekly log. So I had been working in industry, I'd been working as a researcher. I really had no idea what the experience level or what the capability level was of these students that were coming into the class. I had no idea at all. Are they gonna, we're gonna come in the first day and they're all gonna be smarter than me, or they're not gonna have any idea what I'm talking about at all, so you really don't know. So Fred gave me this suggestion where every week to have a deliverable where for 2 or 3 points they would have to fill out this little graded survey. It's just a few points, but they have to fill it out, and they have to give me some kind of feedback. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to kind of paraphrase a few weekly log entries. And again, this is sort of in aggregate. This isn't any exact particular weekly log. One of the first ones that I got after my first week of IST 240 said, "I'd rather see you coding in real time instead of PowerPoint slides." And I said, "Oh no, Fred." So at that point, Fred had told me this, my students were telling me this, so I said to myself, all right, I really have to break down and start doing this. There's no way around this. I'm going to have to learn how to do this. And it really is a skill. For anyone who hasn't tried it, it's tricky to actually sit down, write code, talk about what you're doing, yell at the guy who's sticking gum on his computer in the back, all the kind of classroom management things while you're actually coding. It's challenging, but I feel like it's one of the most important things to do. I feel like if you're teaching programming, the ability to stand up there and do things in real time is invaluable. You make mistakes, and on some level, that's kind of the best part. So your first few times doing this, when you're up in front of 50 students, and all of a sudden you get those syntax errors. I'm not going to lie, you start to get those beads of sweat forming on your forehead. But once you get used to that feeling a little bit, and once you get a little bit more confidence in the fact that you'll eventually figure it out, when you make mistakes, that could actually become the most valuable part, because students get the opportunity to see a real developer going through the process of not only being fallible and making errors, but also going through the process of fixing it. Oh, what did I do wrong here? Did I type the wrong value here? Did I copy the wrong thing? What's the actual mistake that happened? So I think that seeing them, or them seeing me, students seeing me make mistakes, is actually one of the most valuable parts of this. Another weekly log comment that kind of surprised me was, and this is coming from a student, saying students talking in class is distracting. Now, we tend to have this, faculty tends to get sometimes caught up in this us against them kind of thing, but that's not really the case, because when students are talking in class, it's actually a lot of times other students that are more bothered by this than the faculty member is. And they brought this to my attention, and this surprised me. And I felt like this was a really difficult one to deal with, because you have to sort of decide, am I going to just stay focused on teaching and getting my lesson across, or do I want to be in this disciplinarian role? So it's challenging. So what I wound up doing, and I talked to other faculty members quite a bit. I talked to Steve a lot. Steve gives me a lot of advice and wisdom. So a lot of these ideas that you're going to hear today are partially borrowed from Steve in one way or another, or based on something, an idea that I got from talking to him. So I have to give Steve credit as well. I added a blurb to my syllabus about conduct that says, and I stand up there during the first week of class. Some of you, I see some of my students are here today. Thanks for coming. A few of you have seen this, where I stand up on the first day and I say, although this happens extremely rarely, students who conduct themselves in an extremely disrespectful manner, who otherwise repeatedly distract the students from learning, will be asked to leave the classroom. This type of behavior may result in a university disciplinary action in accordance with the university code of conduct, and I provide a link. Now this comes kind of right off the bat as kind of scary, but I emphasize that this isn't targeted at a particular student. This is designed to protect them from people who are distracting, because if I'm standing up here talking about how to traverse a binary search tree, and I'm 20 feet away, and there's a person who's 3 feet away from them talking about what they did over the weekend, it's really hard for that student to get their brain to focus on the binary search tree traversal over the story about what happened at a cafe over the weekend. So I feel like even though this comes off as being kind of aggressive, In practice, I really suggest having a line like this and having a conversation like this, because I feel like it really kind of frees you up to not have to worry as much about discipline later. And just in case anybody's wondering, this did actually happen once. It's only happened once with about the last 1,200 or 1,400 students or so that I've taught. And they didn't wind up getting a university disciplinary action, but we did have a nice conversation in the hallway afterwards, and we all wound up as friends afterwards, and it was fine. So I think that this is something that's useful. My group members are freeloading. I saw this one a lot. A lot of times, I started out, I was in from industry, and I had this idea in my head that group work is really valuable, and I still feel that way. I still feel that group work is really valuable, because once we leave the walls of this place, we go out and we work in industry, and we work in groups. I mean, almost nobody, unless you're an independent contractor, working in your basement, that's different, but typically most students will go out and work in groups, so it's really valuable to have this experience of working in groups. However, what would tend to happen is you have a group of 4, and there'd be 2 people crowded around a computer, and the other 2, whether it's intentional or whether it's just because of sort of the geography of the space, they get kind of squeezed out of being able to contribute to it. So this was a challenging one. So what I wound up doing, and I've been doing it to this day, is now I alternate between individual assignments and pair assignments. And the pair assignments are optional. So it's optional to work with a partner. And once you've started working with a partner, it's actually optional to continue working with that partner. So what you avoid is the situation where you agree to be a group with somebody, and your group member is out of class all week, and then 45 minutes before the assignment's due, they send you an email that says, hey, how's our assignment coming? Could you send me what you have so far? In this case, in the setup that I use, you don't have any responsibility to group members. It's on a basis where you continue working with your partner as long as it makes sense for everyone. Now, I still do big group activities, but I always do it as low points, sort of in-class activities. So if group members are freeloading, it's really not that big of a deal. Our $90 textbook is terrible. This is actually kind of an easy one to work around, partly because our university library has so many really good books that are available to students for free. So I always try to find textbooks that are available through library.psu.edu, and you could just log in from there. If students want to buy a paper copy, they can. One semester I was teaching IST 110 and I actually took this a little bit further. What I wound up doing was I found a Creative Commons license textbook that allowed you to remix it and reshare it, and I wound up taking each chapter and sharing it with the class as a Google Doc, and the assignment was to read it and then make comments and then comment on other people's comments. So that was kind of fun, because the textbook went from this sort of static, dusty thing that sat on a desk into this more kind of dynamic, living thing that students could, interact with. And it was kind of this artifact that they developed on their own. Now, this is kind of the worst one. I'm happy to say that I haven't seen this one in a long time, but I've had students mention this. I wasn't sure what you wanted me to do. I feel like there's a lot of temptation for us to sort of say in vague assignments that, students want freedom, students want flexibility. And on some level that's true, but I think that what it really comes down to is that although an assignment might be flexible, an assignment might have some flexibility inside of it, students also need to know what the requirements are. So they need to know what it is that they actually have to get done. If they have 6 other assignments that need to get done that week, how do they prioritize things? We kind of make the assumption sometimes that, well, I just want them to spend enough time exploring in this area, but when it comes down to that optimization and there's 6 assignments due, that doesn't always happen. So based on student feedback, I feel like one of the really important things to mention is what exactly the expectations are. I don't have too many more of these. About 85 more PowerPoint slides, that's it. No. One that I really liked was, can we choose our own topics sometime? And I really thought about this one because it kind of stumped me. Because on some level, it's like, well, no, you can't. I don't even really get to choose the topics. We have a prescribed curriculum, and we get a little bit of latitude of how we want to address it, and there's kind of that 80-20 rule of, but basically, students don't get to choose their own topic. So I thought about this, and I came up with an activity that I do in lots of classes now, and it's called learning by teaching. So what we do is, for a week typically, we'll go over a few class periods, and the first class period of the activity, students will pick a partner, and with that partner, they'll research some type of skill or some type of activity that is some programming technique that's related to what we're doing, but we haven't actually gotten into it. So if I do this in IST 311, maybe it'll be something about network security or something about cryptocurrency or something that's sort of tangentially related, but it's not really related. They get to work together with a partner and prepare some teaching material and prepare a lesson, and then on the next day, they get to deliver that. So that pair will meet up with another pair, and they take turns presenting that activity to one another. So does it change the course of the semester and let them choose all the topics that they want? Pick your own syllabus? No. But when we have time, when it fits in, I try to take 2 or 3 class periods and allow students to do this learning by teaching activity. And the feedback that I've gotten from this has really been some of the most positive of all the things that I've received. If anybody has any questions along the way, by the way, feel free to kind of interrupt me and we could chat about this. It doesn't have to just be me talking nonstop. So feel free if anyone has anything to say. So one of the questions you might have, if you're sitting in the audience now, is, wow, you make these weekly logs and all the comments are really terrible. How do you feel about that? And that's not the case. There's actually, I've been kind of focusing on the terrible comments or the negative comments because I feel like that's where a lot of the value is as far as figuring out what can we be doing differently. But for the most part, you mostly get good comments. I'd say probably 90-some% of the comments are good, and it does, I'll admit, it does feel good to get these positive comments, and the positive comments kind of help to carry you through the times when sometimes maybe it's not so easy, maybe you have a few academic integrity violations that week and people are mad at you about different things, and so I feel like the good comments really do kind of help to make it all worthwhile. So if you're thinking about adding something to your teaching, I feel like the weekly log comments are a good way to go. Does anybody have any questions about any of those things or want to argue with me? Or Chris?
What's the prompt that you give your students for the log?
So the prompt, that's a great question. The prompt actually changes. So the question was, what is the prompt that you give your students, for anyone listening at home that can't hear? So the prompt really kind of varies depending on what we've been doing that week, but in general, it's something along the lines of, how's this week going for you so far? What have you enjoyed learning about? Is there anything that you struggled about? Do you have any suggestions for the rest of the semester? That's kind of the standard one. Other times, if I'm trying an activity that we've never done before, I'll kind of emphasize some aspect of that activity and say, how did this part of that work out for you, and so on. So sometimes I'll give specific prompts, but it's generally, how are things going? What's working good? What would you suggest? That type of thing. Any other questions? Yes?
What's the vehicle that you use to get those comments from? Is it like a paper that people turn in, or is it something else?
The question was, what is the vehicle that you use to get those comments turned in? I actually do it in Canvas as a graded survey. So if you go in, and it's a little hard to find because it's under quizzes. So if you go add new quiz and then graded survey in Canvas. And I typically make it worth 3 points. And I don't do it every week usually. Like I'll do it every week for a while, and then sometimes I'll do it every other week, because if you do it every week, it tends to get sort of rote. Like it tends to just be, people do it on autopilot and say things are going great. One time I just got a thumbs up emoji, and that was the entire weekly log comment. So I try to break it up a little bit. It also depends on the class. So this semester I'm teaching IST 250, which I've never taught before, so I do a lot more weekly logs in there than I do in, say, IST 242 that I've taught a bunch of times. So a lot of it depends on kind of my experience, my amount of experience with that class as well. Lisa?
Can you share like a summary of what students have been saying with the students in class, or somehow report back to them?
I don't share it sort of directly, like actual, like tangibly, but I do mention comments a lot of times that I'll say, I've been getting a lot of feedback that we're moving a bit quickly, so I'm going to go back and do this. And a lot of it comes down to aggregate. So it's not always necessarily one comment that stands alone, but if you have 50 students in a class, some people are going to say, I don't understand what we did. We were going way too fast this week. And some people are going to say, I feel like we're going way too slow this week. So, you can't take individual responses, but you have to kind of weigh it together and say, all right, there's an 80-20 split this week that thinks we're going too fast. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll come in after I see that, and I'll say, so I've been getting a lot of feedback that we might be moving a little fast. What topics do we want to talk about? And then I'll kind of allocate some class time to actually go back and revisit those topics a little bit more. But that's an interesting idea to almost do like a poll kind of thing, where students vote in the poll and then see the percentages. Twitter poll for classroom or something like that. But any other questions? All right, so one of the areas that I feel are especially interesting is when we start to get to sort of these edge cases of students that are kind of on the edge or on the verge of being something else. So they're not just a student, they're kind of on the edge of going out into industry. So they're going into interviews, and I meet with students a lot since I do teach a lot of the kind of the fundamental programming classes and things that students need to prepare for interviews. A lot of times I'll meet with students when they have an interview coming up, and we'll talk about it. So I get to sort of as exchange or as my return on investment for taking the time to help them prepare for their interview. They come back to me and tell me what the interview was like, and how did it go? What did they do? What kind of questions did they ask? And so on. So one of the questions, and I know this is a little controversial to include this up here, but one of the questions the students tend to come back from interviews with is, why don't we learn more about data structures and algorithms? This isn't an easy one to address because making curriculum changes is more than just one instructor deciding to do things different. But we have been. I mean, me and I've been talking a lot with Steve about this over the past few years, and I think that we've been improving a lot in this area, and I think that IST students do know a lot more about data structures and algorithms than they did a few years ago. So even though you can't always do exactly what students ask for, we take it back and we share it and we talk about it and figure out ways that we can kind of find ways to add more of this into the curriculum. Another interesting one that really surprised me from a student interview, and this kind of blew my mind. I've never coded on a whiteboard. I was like, oh, why haven't I been doing this? Why haven't I been having whiteboarding interview sessions with these students that tell me that they have an interview coming up with Microsoft? They go into a room and they're expecting to sit down at a computer and be asked to write a program, but instead they walk them to a whiteboard and give them a red marker and say, show me how to do a selection sort or whatever. And if you've done this before, it's really not that bad. But if you've never done it, it's terrible. It's almost like the first, couple times you try juggling. It's not like it takes that long to learn how to juggle a little bit, but if someone hands you 3 balls and says to juggle them, the first 5 minutes of doing it is going to be terrible. So what I've started doing is when a student comes to me and says, hey, I've got an interview coming up, and what should we do to practice? We do whiteboard sessions. So we'll typically start out with a really easy one. I'll tell them to do some kind of write a function to reverse a string or do some kind of manipulation on a string. And then once they get through that, I'll ask them to write a tic-tac-toe game or something like that. Those 2 examples, reverse a string and tic-tac-toe, are actual examples from a student that had an interview for an internship at Microsoft. And they let me know what the 2 Microsoft whiteboarding questions were. So that things like that are useful. So it's handy to hear back. And the first time they do it is always terrible. Almost without exception, the first thing that everyone does when they're trying to code a problem on a whiteboard is they pretend that it's a coding environment, and they start writing, really big, taking up the whole whiteboard, system.out.println, do this, system.out, and after 30 seconds, they've filled the whole whiteboard with, 4 lines of code because it's different. It's just a different environment. So anytime that a student is looking for practice in that environment, I always feel like getting them on a whiteboard is a good idea. Another one is GitHub. So GitHub is huge now. Anytime that students interact with industry, whether it's an internship or a job offer, a job interview, industry wants to hear about GitHub. Not only is GitHub really useful for just being able to put it on your resume, but just learning what's called Git flows or the Git workflow makes you think about code in a different way, because it makes you think about what are the states that my code is moving through. I've written some lines on my computer. Now I feel like it's at a certain status. Now it's worth saving. Now it's worth merging with other code. It gives you a sense not just about what the external workflow is, but it helps you think about your code in a different way. Now, it has a bit of a steep learning curve, and I do use it in class. In IST 311 a few times, and I'm trying to think if any of the students who were here for this. I don't think they were here for this particular activity, but one of the things that I've done before in IST 311 is we'll do one big coding project. So 40 students are all collaborating. One time what I did was sim IST, so we created a simulation of the IST building where one small group was working on modeling how the elevator works, another one was doing classroom scheduling, another one was doing the projectors and food service, and we tried to combine it all together with everyone doing pull requests in GitHub. Now, from a software engineering perspective, it was a nightmare. It was terrible because you're going to have so many merge conflicts, and people just don't have enough experience at that point to really make it work effectively from a software engineering perspective. But from a learning perspective, it was great because students got to see what it's actually like to see realistic merge conflicts when you're dealing with a realistic amount of traffic. If you have two people coding together, and that's it, and they're going, okay, you're ready for me to enter mine? Yep, okay, you're ready for me to enter yours? That's one thing, but when you actually get into a realistic situation where there's dozens of people potentially trying to modify the same file at the same time, it's a whole different ballpark. And students have gotten back to me and said that having that experience, even though it was kind of horrific at the time, was actually really useful in different kinds of interview situations. So this brings us to Unreasonable Expectations and Aviation Metaphor number 2. So kind of where all of your private pilot training comes together, you go on something called a check ride, where you spend about 5 hours with an examiner, and they ask you to do all these things outside of the plane and inside the plane to demonstrate whether you're actually going to be a safe pilot or not. And one of the things that they do, you're flying this plane, you've just been sweating through this like 2-hour interview on the ground, and now you're finally going flying. And one of the things that they'll do is they'll send these very rapid fire requests at you. They'll say, turn left, heading 132, climb to altitude this, turn to heading this, turn left, call up tower, what's your distance from this, what's that? And they don't actually expect you to be able to do all these things. They just expect you to not crash the plane in the process of trying, basically. And this idea of unreasonable expectations carries over a lot into software engineering and into a lot of situations that programmers, that developers find themselves in. If you're working on an agile development project, you might have a client that says to you, we need this, we need that, we need all these things done, we have $200 to spend on it. And a lot of times the expectations are really unreasonable. So a lot of times what it comes down to is just figuring out something that's workable for everyone. You might get a request that's impossible, but at the same time, you want to figure out something that makes some kind of contribution or that does a little bit. Like one of the key ideas of agile software development is that with every iteration, you add something of value. You're creating something rather than just kind of making a mess. So one activity that I have students do along these lines, I call it unreasonable expectations, and I have them walk in, get into small groups, and I tell them, okay, you all know what Siri is? You have 20 minutes, write Siri. And everyone goes, I can't write Siri in 20 minutes. But when you think about it, there's a few different ways of dealing with that. It's an unreasonable expectation to have to write Siri in 20 minutes, but there's a few ways. You can throw your hands up and go, yeah, I don't know how to write Siri. See you later. Thanks for coming. Or you can sit down and just kind of start coding things and make a mess without thinking about where you're going, and that's not good either. Or what you could do is you could say, well, I understand something about Siri. Is there some sort of central aspect to Siri that I can actually do something with? And maybe in 20 minutes, we'll create something of value. So maybe they'll sit down and they'll say, well, what does Siri do? You ask it questions. It says, what do you want to do today? Or whatever. That's the Microsoft one. But, it asks you some sort of question. So, all right, I'll sit down, I'll write a prompt. What would you like to do? Then they'll discover, all right, I don't actually know enough about language processing to respond to it in that way, so I could say, what would you like to do today? For information about the weather, press 1. To do this, press 2. And in 20 minutes, you'd actually be surprised that you can make a little bit of a simple conversational agent that takes a few words and kind of responds back and forth. So on some level, even though the initial ask, the initial expectation was completely unreasonable, it's still possible to do something that's pretty useful in a 20-minute time period. Does anybody have any questions about that? So I know a few people have to duck out in a few minutes, so I'm going to try to keep this a little bit quick. Another area where listening is really useful is the learning assistant. I talked about students who are kind of at that bubble of being something else. And learning assistants are a prime example of students who are also something else. You know, they're a learning assistant, they're a student, but they're also working in some capacity as a teacher as well. And they're really valuable because, I mean, I have to think back 30 years to come up with a memory of a time where I didn't know how to program. Sometimes learning assistants might have learned how to program 6 months ago or a year ago in some cases where they had no idea how to program at all. And now some learning assistants are actually great programmers where a year ago they didn't know how to program at all. So they have a lot more first-hand experience and first-hand recent memory of what that experience is like to transition from someone with no idea how to code to someone who's pretty good at it than I do. So I feel like listening to your learning assistants is really invaluable. And I think that with learning assistants especially, it doesn't come down to just listening to them. It comes down to creating an environment where they feel comfortable to give you suggestions. Because I think it's really easy to make it seem like, all right, I'm the all-knowing and you're my helper, so I don't want your, keep your opinions to yourself. And that's the opposite of what you want. What you really want is a situation where if you go through something way too fast, the LAs are going to come up to you after class and go, no, that's not, you went way too fast over that, and give you the opportunity to go back. So I feel like taking the time to both choose your learning assistants carefully, make sure that they're well equipped, make sure to kind of talk through different scenarios that come up and things that could go wrong and give them ideas for handling things in class. Make it really obvious that their feedback is really useful to you and that you're thick-skinned and, if they give you criticism, it's not going to hurt your feelings. Listening to peers. I'm glad that Lisa's here today because I'm going to mention something. I hope you don't mind. I didn't ask you ahead of time. So don't worry, it's nothing bad. Lisa did my very first peer review when I was teaching IST 240, and it stuck out in my head because she gave me a really excellent and really well thought out peer review. It was super valuable. I learned so much from it. And one of the things that she told me on this peer review was that I was talking to the screen. So what I would do, I would write, I'd write some code or have a PowerPoint slide, and I would kind of do this, I guess, and just sort of describe it. And I could picture myself doing it, and it sticks in my head to this day. Like at the time, it was just like it was like a lightning bolt going off. I was like, oh, I do that. That's terrible. Why do I have my back on? All these students went through all the trouble to not only pay for an education but come to class to see me, and here I am, turning my back to them and talking to a PowerPoint slide. So thanks for that, Lisa. I appreciate it. That's been really helpful over the years. And not just peer evaluations, but also listening to peers. I mentioned, I have a lot of conversations with Steve and with Fred, and we talk a lot. And I think it's important just to talk about what's working, what isn't working, what are some of the troubles that you've seen, because a lot of problems, or a lot of problems as well as things that work well, happen again and again. So it's really useful, I think, if you can learn from others. So I'm going to kind of wrap things up slowly in the process of wrapping things up, because I know people have to leave in a few minutes. I want to talk about what I do in a typical class. People say sometimes, well, do you just kind of lecture for 50 minutes or 75 minutes? What I try to do, I try to follow this pattern as much as I can of keeping just lecturing, keeping talking like this to a minimum. So in all honesty, this feels a little bit weird to me because I've been standing up here for a long time and I'm not like typing anything I'm not writing code, I'm not having people do activities, but a lot of times it's necessary to just talk about a topic for a few minutes. I try to keep it to like 6 or 8 minutes tops, because after that you start to lose people. Then I'll try to do some live coding. So the idea with that is that people kind of code along with me, so they're engaged, or they're more invited to be engaged with it because I'm doing something in real time, they're doing something in real time. If they ask a question, that question might actually steer us to go off in a different direction or make the program wind up being something a little bit different than we originally intended. It makes people feel vested in it and kind of engaged in what we're doing. Finally, after that, I try to have an activity. So I spend a little bit of time talking, a moderate amount of time kind of working together where I'm coding, they're coding, and then an activity where me and the LAs are going around and helping them. Is it a magic formula? No, but it tends to work for me. That's just kind of the balance that I feel that's worked out the best. Finally, I think that what it all really comes down to, a lot of times you're going to get conflicting information. You're going to get, certain faculty members telling you to do one thing, students telling you to do other things. You're going to get all kinds of conflicts, and eventually it comes down to really listening to yourself. So finally, I just want to dedicate this song. I want to dedicate this song. I'm going to sing. No, I'm not going to sing. Dedicate this lecture to Dave, who used to say onward and upward a lot. So thanks for coming. Onward and upward. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
We're just like your students. We're all asking.
I know.